What I decided to do this week is something on measurement, because we didn't talk about that with the rest of design. So measurement, but also see if we can do a little bit on analysis. And at the end, we'll discuss whether we wrap this series up here, or whether we want to continue with something else. So all these sessions, this one included, there'll be some short presentations, there'll be some discussion or sort of practical work, group work with some questions to answer. So just a reminder what we mean by the research cycle. There's lots of ways in which this is characterized. The one that I've been using is this one that says, okay, researchers engage with communities and farmers. We do some work on the context and problems and maybe visioning. And then we come up with questions that require research, maybe options to compare, problems to solve. We work on the research approach to use and the research design. We collect data. We do some sort of data analysis and interpretation and decide what to do next, and the cycle continues that way. Now, the participatory research principle or paradigm, if you like, has been used in our sort of work for many years now. It was during the 1980s it became popular. So for the last 40 years, many people have said they're using participatory research approaches. And when you look at what they're actually doing, typically they're involving farmers in this step here of identifying problems and questions, things to compare. But the rest of the cycle is very much dominated by researchers and researchers determining what gets done and how to do it. And that is not what farmer research networks are about. If you look at the farmer research network principles, they say, no, this is a joint effort that farmers and researchers and anybody else in the network do these things together all the way around, not just at the problem identification stage, but at all stages. And participants actually at our last East Africa Community of Practice meeting in Uganda last October said we'd like more information on what that means and how to do that at these other stages. And that's why we set up this seminar series, and it's what we've been talking about. We've done quite a lot on design, and we're going to talk a little bit more about design, including data measurement and collection here, and also something on analysis today. All the way through this, we're talking about involving farmers, and not just involving them, but really empowering them. Empowering them meaning that they are actively engaged in the decision making about what gets done and how it gets done. And that involves negotiation. If you can involve people and empower them and negotiate and reach common understandings, you can genuinely co-create research. So that's what we're aiming to do, a co-creation of research. And what has become very clear during these sessions is that there are two aspects of this which are equally important. They're connected. One is about how we work together, how researchers and farmers and anybody else in the Farmer Research Network actually sit down and do things together. What does it take to do effective co-creation? What sort of relationships do you need to have between people? And then the second topic is, okay, so what research methods emerge? And we focused on that one last week. We're saying, look, what researchers often believe is necessary for good researchers sometimes clashes with what farmers feel is appropriate or what they want to do. How do we deal with that? And how can we recognize whether this Farmer Research Network research is actually good, useful, valid research? And what are the consequences of changing some of these rules about research? So we've been sort of talking about the two of those, and they are related to each other, and we'll continue that today. So in the last session, we had another exchange between a researcher, Dr. Sayansi, and a farmer research network group leader, Mama Kilima, and they both proposed the designs that they would like to have for a cowpea variety trial that the farmers are going to do. And you looked at the video of that exchange and you commented on it. We discussed that. And here's my sort of summary of what came out of that. It was an experiment, and I had deliberately picked this example because it's really amongst the easiest sort of things we can think of doing, the easiest sort of research. Variety trials of a crop that farmers are already growing, so they're familiar with the crop. It's just that they're trying some new varieties. So in some ways, it's the simplest sort of situation. And if you weren't here when I introduced this, I made up this example, and that was quite deliberate. I wanted to choose something that was kind of familiar to everybody, which was simple. But I also didn't want to look at a real example because we were being quite critical about some things that Dr. Sayansi and Mama Kolima were saying, and I didn't want to put real projects on the spot to be criticized in that way. So it was a made-up example, but I hope it was realistic and familiar. So what came out of the discussion last week, first of all, realizing that there are always choices to make in the research design and in an experimental design. And as a researcher, you might be familiar with some sort of standard practices. This is the way we do variety trials, or this is the way we do a soil health trial. And yet that usual way is never the only way in which things can be done. And it's never the only valid or useful way in which things can be done. So if we're going to come up with designs that meet everybody's requirements, we need joint understanding. Joint, I mean farmers and researchers and those other people involved, like extension officers. We need joint understanding of both the reasons for design preferences. Why is it farmers would want to do something some way? We had the example of whether they should include a control plot, a control treatment. And the farmers in our example didn't want to include a control treatment. So rather than just saying you have to include a control treatment, we need to understand why they don't want to, and then see if, what do we do on the basis of that? Maybe sometimes they're going to have misunderstood things, and explaining why it would be a good idea would be the right thing to do. But sometimes it means that we as researchers reassess why we're insisting on something. We realize that actually it's not necessary and there are alternatives. And figuring that out involves referring to principles. What's the principle behind having a control treatment? It's quite hard to figure that one out sometimes. When you're making these choices, the exact objectives of the trial matter, and both the researchers' exact objectives and farmers' exact objectives matter, and they will influence the choices. If we just say we're going to do a cowpea variety trial, that doesn't tell us what the real objective is. We're going to see another video of these two people shortly. And in that one, if you pay attention, you'll see they have modified the objectives from what they originally had. Originally, the researcher thought they were going to measure the yield of these cowpea varieties, see how well they perform. And the researcher has now realized that actually that's not quite what their objective is, because they know that these are good varieties. They know that these varieties potentially perform well because that's why they've been developed and released. Okay. Actually, researchers' objectives, you'll hear, are to find out how those varieties are going to fit into and support those farmers' agriculture farm systems. And it turns out measuring yield isn't actually necessary for that. So those objectives need to be clear and thought out. Don't assume you know what the objectives are. Last week, we heard researchers' phrases such as, we will require farmers to do this and will not allow farmers to do that. We'll require them all to grow the same things, will not allow them to plant on different dates. If, as researchers, we're using language like that, it reveals that we are not thinking of this as joint activity. If you as researchers are saying, I will allow farmers to do this and I'll not allow farmers to do that, it implies that you are thinking of this as your experiment that farmers are somehow helping with. But if it's a real joint activity, this is not your experiment. It's not for you as researchers to decide what farmers will be allowed or not allowed to do. It's a question of jointly deciding what to do so that jointly your objectives are met. And if you end up realizing that you have multiple objectives and farmers have some objectives and researchers have those objectives, and those cannot be brought together into joint objectives, then you might well need different and multiple research activities. So if you find that you just can't resolve the differences, perhaps you're trying to force too many different things into one activity, and you need to separate them. And many of you are used to things like that. You've seen this mother and baby trial approach where a sort of central experiment, the mother trial, is something that's rather highly controlled by researchers. Researchers decide what to do. It's surrounded by baby trials that farmers do on their own fields, which have much more flexibility. I don't like the terminology here. It implies that the baby is somehow lesser than the mother. I don't know. But the point is that mother and baby trial is a way of having multiple objectives by having multiple research activities. I like to think of the mother trials as one research activity, the baby trials as another. They're linked, but they're separate things. All right, that's sort of where we got to at the end of last week. And what I want to do today is pick up two different topics. First, one more aspect of designing, in this case, the same experiment, and that's the measurement and collecting data. But then also see if we can squeeze in something on involving farmers in data analysis. So what we're going to do, we'll look at another video, and this is just a reminder of the situation that these videos are about. There's an FRN that's been going for some years. So these farmers and researchers have done research together before. They've done experiments together before, so they know what's what. There's a group, an FRN group with about 20 members, and they have a group leader who is a very vocal and articulate farmer group leader. They're growing cowpea, and they've decided they're going to do a variety trial where there are up to 10 new varieties to try. And the first videos, they were kind of disagreeing over how the experiment should be done. They've now agreed, and what they're going to decide in this video is what to measure in the trial that they're doing. So we'll show the video, and as you're watching the video, I want you to think carefully about how is the relationship between the farmer leader and the scientists now. I hope that what's portrayed in the video is a bit different from the first one you saw, and I'd like your comments there. And also, what do you think about the choices they're making on measurement in this trial? Are they realistic and reasonable, and will they meet their objectives? Okay, so we'll go into groups to discuss what they've seen in the video. After the video, we go into groups and you can discuss this question about what you've seen. Okay, but also while you're in groups, I'd like you to discuss any experiences you have of engaging farmers in analysis of data. So I'll say this again before we go into groups, but we're going to discuss that in the same group so that we can be efficient in using the group work.
Good afternoon, Dr. Sayansi. Thank you for coming to see our fields today.
Good afternoon, Mama Kulima. Thank you for showing me around. It's been so interesting to see what you've been doing since we did the soil experiments together.
Those experiments have really helped us understand organic matter and how organic matter is important for the soil. some of our members have started their own experiments now.
Ah, what are they doing?
They are trying chicken manure added to compost to see if it makes good compost faster.
Ah, that's a good idea. I will be interested in the results. Can we talk about the new cowpea trial today?
Yes, Dr. Sayansi. Our members asked me to talk to you about that again because we all have agreed on how we'll do it. We remember that some of the data collection in the soil experiment was very tedious for us and would want to avoid that.
Okay, I think we should be able to do that. Now that we've agreed that this is a joint experiment and it's not to measure the yield of the cowpeas, because we know these new varieties can all perform well. So you want to know which varieties will be most useful to your members, and I would like to know how the new varieties will contribute to your farms.
You know, we don't always grow the type that makes the most grain because there are lots of other things to consider.
Okay, so what are the things that are important about cowpea that will help you decide which ones you want? Let's list them, because then those are the things we need to collect data about.
Oh, let me think. How well they germinate, whether they spread out or climb. That is very important when intercropping, and whether there are insects on the flowers.
Okay, do you mean bees?
No, those very small beetles that eat the flowers. What are they called, Dr. Sayansi?
Maybe thrips. I will find out. What else?
So we'd also want to know how many leaves there are and how good they are to eat, and the length of time it takes to cook the grain. Oh, yes, and the time from planting to harvesting. That is very important for us.
Ah, okay. So, well, we know how long each of these varieties takes to mature. So I can tell your members that, and that will help them choose the varieties they want to try. So let's make a list here, like this. So here we have the list, and here we can write down how to measure each of the important traits.
Okay, so can we also decide who will take the measurements and record the data? Last time we were confused. We thought you would do it.
Ah, good idea. Here. So to measure germination, you need to count the seeds planted, then count how many come up.
That is very slow, Dr. Sayansi. You can do that if you want, but what is important to us is whether germination is as good as our current variety. And we can decide that just by looking.
Okay, so you could measure germination like that instead. If we made a paper for each of your members, then had a list of all the varieties they were testing, could they write down whether the germination was low, same as usual, or high?
Yes, and we can help each other if anyone finds it difficult.
Okay, good. So let's fill in that table. So now we've got for germination, let's compare it with the current situation or the current varieties, and who would do it? The farmers. Okay.
I am most worried about counting those insects on the flowers. They don't all come out at once, and so you have to count often, and it takes a long time.
Okay. Another farmer group had some of their young people doing that. They were interested in learning about the insects, and we helped them record data on a phone, which they were proud to do. Would that be possible here?
Yes, I know who would like to do that.
Okay, good. So I've written that down as well. Okay, weekly observations during flowering, and that's by the youth. I was wondering whether the leaf tasting and the grain cooking time could be done together by your group at one of your meetings. Maybe we don't need each member to do it by themselves. Everyone can taste, but you can share the cooking.
We'll make it a cowpea feast, Dr. Sayansi, and you are invited to the cowpea feast.
And I will be there, Mama Kulima. Thank you.
It's very nice to see how these two are getting on. It's our FRN soap opera. It seems to be developing nicely. So Shifa is going to send us to groups now, and we'll have about 20 minutes to talk about what we've seen in that video. And I'd like you to think about both the relationship between the FRN leader and the scientist, and also about the way they're making choices on measurement. But then spend some time also in your group to just capture experiences from anybody on engaging farmers in analysis of data. And here I'm really talking about analyzing data. That is making sense of the data that's been collected. I'm not just talking about sharing results of analysis that you as researchers have done, but where you've actually involved farmers in doing analysis. Maybe you don't have any experiences, but if you do, it'd be nice to just to mention them so that we can get some feedback from the groups on that. So, hello everybody. Are you all back here now? Shifa, can you tell if everybody's back here now?
Yes, we are all back, Rick.
Okay. So what I'd like to do is we're going to have feedback from the groups on question number 1, any observations on measurement. And I ask whoever's presenting to just try and, pick up the key points. And if a previous group has already said what you've observed, then you don't need to repeat it. And then I will try and wrap up the discussion on measurement, and then we'll hear your feedback on question number 2, analysis. Okay, somebody from group 1, I think that was Sam. Can you take us through that one?
So there was a bit initial discussion about Dr. Sayansi saying things which she already knew and whether that was appropriate or not to be discussing in that kind of language of saying, oh, I know about all this already, and is that something then telling the farmers why are they bothering doing this experiment? But I think there was a bit of a back and forth on, it's very likely by the time they're getting to do this trial, all these new varieties will have been assessed already to a certain extent, and there are lots of things that will already be known from the previous experiments done. So there's a two-way process of sharing some of the information they know already, the researcher knows already, but then also getting some of the concerns from the farmer about the real world questions and criteria that they might be assessing on, so the issue to do with the beetles that was mentioned. And then there was a general feedback that the relationship has evolved positively between the two. They are sharing tasks, and rather than the researcher dictating tasks, and there's two-way dialogue going on between how things are being measured and what's being measured, and there's compromise from both sides, and there's perhaps the point there on joint decision making to do with the germination, where it was actually the farmer who was leading some of the suggestions and the researcher was taking that on board and not pushing back, but then the farmer was also feeling comfortable acknowledging certain limitations and a misunderstanding that had happened in the previous round. So there was evidence of that open improvement, and the invitation to come to the cowpea feast at the end of the video as well. Yeah, there was also a general point there of getting the importance of striking the balance between the quality of the data and the way in which the interactions are happening. So it's always important to have both of those criteria in mind to make sure it's a human interaction, but at the same time ensuring that the data that is collected is going to be useful and is going to be of high quality. So not focusing just on the former and forgetting that everybody involved is a human.
Okay, thanks very much indeed. Can we hear somebody from group 2 that's on the screen? I don't know who that is.
I think that'll be me, Jane. We generally thought it was positive. We did feel that there was a lot of compromise from the researcher, and so obviously it was a short video, but there are scientific measurements that are still needed. Then they should think about, having a technician in the field or something. So we felt that the compromise was good, and everything that they were coming up with solutions together. There was win-win research, but we were probably missing some other observations that might be needed. that the researcher might need to do themselves while respecting what the farmers are able and willing to do.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so the first part, I go ahead and then others can jump in if I'm forgetting something. But generally, there was acknowledgement of a better, more positive relationship between the researcher and Mama Kulima. And something that probably hasn't been mentioned yet is the fact that although the scientists seem to be more accommodating of the farmers in general, they may have some other knowledge, prior knowledge related to the context, that there was a question of how to bring in that knowledge in a nice way, in a way that is fair in the relationship with the farmers, and a need to understand the context better of where this experiment is being run.
So I think what we're hearing, if I try and summarize, then we're hearing, first of all, in terms of relationships, that people are seeing improvement, more respect, more listening, more mutual understanding, some compromise and so on. In terms of what the actual measurements taken, okay, some disagreements there as to whether what's coming up is reasonable or not. To me, what's important is that there are choices. So something like the germination rate. People doing this sort of work have always measured germination rate by counting the seeds planted and how many emerged. And now we're saying that's certainly one way of measuring germination rate, but there are choices. And we came up in this experiment with an alternative, which will probably actually be quite effective, because it doesn't matter if the germination rate is 60% or 70%. What matters is whether it's at least as good as what farmers are getting at the moment. What matters is whether it's terribly low or whether it's going to give a stand of cowpeas. And that's the sort of measurement that was being taken. So those usual measurements may not be appropriate for a joint FRN experiment. There might be some other things which are relevant. This point, maybe this one didn't come out of the discussion. Farmers and researchers use data and learn in different ways, so may want to measure different things and in different ways. But yeah, but okay, the germination rate example is one of that. This idea that farmers are trying to say, are these new varieties going to help me? Are they going to allow me to improve what's going on? And for that, it's sort of, is a germination rate better than the current variety is what's important, not the actual rate of germination. And then this point at the end of it, don't expect farmers to measure and record data that only you, the researcher, want. I think we've often heard farmers say, if you want the data, that's fine. We're very happy for you to come and collect data, but don't expect us to spend our time and effort collecting data which is only relevant or interesting to you farmers. And I realized we actually had an interesting investigation of this done a few years ago now by Dan Nyambok, and Nuru was helping. I think it was in 2019, and I don't think it was ever written up, which is a shame. So if either Dan or Nuru are online now, this is a reminder that this would be worth writing up sometimes. What they did was a study on information that farmers want to record and use. And there were some important findings from it. First one, okay, farmers using both qualitative and quantitative information. We probably knew that. Second one, information from their own plot is most important. Information from close neighbors, those group members, is next most important. Information from somewhere else, people they don't know, is kind of least important in terms of influencing their decisions and building their knowledge. So their own data is critical. Own data and experience is given by far the most weight. And that actually has some implications, because that's the information which is all in their head. And this is sometimes why we hear from farmers saying, okay, the data, I know this. I've observed it. I've seen it. I don't need to write it down. I don't need to record it, because I've seen it. I know what's what. So if you somebody else wants to know about it and wants it written down, then you've got to help with that, because I don't need to write it down. So written records are for somebody else. And the analysis they did showed that there are lots of factors involved in determining whether a farmer might be interested, enthusiastic in recording data. And it is to do with those personalities, and it's to do with the type of information and who it's for, and so on. There's no simple answer. But these are things you need to bring into account when you are conducting that negotiation on the data measurement and data recording. And I think this is an area where more research would be very useful. It's a sort of research that you can layer on top of things that you're doing anyway. It's a sort of research that you can do using a sort of participant observation type methods and so on, where you don't need to disrupt the way the FRN is working and the research they're doing on cow bee varieties or anything else, to be able to also start learning about data and who's interested in collecting data and why they are or are not interested in collecting data. I think it would be a very constructive sort of thing to get a bit more research done on. We're going to go on to the analysis question, but before we do, I'll just stop for a minute and allow anybody to make any further comments on measurement. This is a really quick overview. There's on all these topics we've been talking about, there's lots more we could do. Before I move on, would anybody like to say anything else about measurement in these sorts of co-created research trials? No. Okay. So what I'd like to do now, oh, Sarah, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just thinking of the kind of qualitative measurements. I think that didn't come out very strongly here, but I would like to hear a bit more about that, and taking advantage of the fact that now we all have phones with a camera on them and can use pictures as methods of collecting data and all that. Yeah, I just want to hear a bit about that.
Can you tie that comment up to this example of the variety trial? How might, for example, pictures be useful there?
Can I tie it to something else? I was thinking of,
yep,
for example, the Striga thing where people were going there to really measure, you know, one plant after another of Striga. And I'm thinking, would they not just take a picture of the plot and show that this has more purple, blue flowers and the other one, so it has more Striga on it or something like that?
Okay. Yeah. That's a being imaginative about data measurement. Certainly in the way I understand it, a picture can be data. If it's taken for a purpose and used to understand what's going on, then a picture is data. And you should think about using pictures for collecting data about something like a variety trial. Yep. What you do need to be careful with is whether you have the resources to analyze the data from pictures. Having lots of farmers sort of taking pictures of their plots and somehow collecting those together is useless if nobody's got the time to go through and learn something from all those pictures. So make sure, and that connects nicely to the next theme of this afternoon's session. Being able to analyze the data is necessary. And I think it's really easy these days with things like phones and photographs to say, okay, just take a picture and we've got it recorded. Yes, but if you don't have the capacity of whatever that are the resources to make sense of those pictures, then there's really no point in doing it. All right, so what we're going to do is just go back to the groups. And maybe Romina, can you share your file again? And this time we'll start with you. Do you have anything to say about involving farmers in data analysis?
Okay, so we had comments and shared experiences about how it is different and easier probably to involve farmers when it comes to co-creating and co-learning in the cycle of research and generating data based on and synthesizing data based on the priority areas that are identified within communities and the landscapes, and then selecting what is most important for community members, and then looking at the frequency of the areas that come up. So in this way, it is easier to engage farmers. And then there was a comment about how it is a bit more difficult when it comes to conducting more statistical analysis, where farmers don't have knowledge or access to computers and softwares to carry out that kind of analysis. Then there was another idea about how usually, especially from a qualitative point of view, when farmers are collecting data, the stage of data analysis is not really, it's a bit merged, it's not really separate from the stage of collection. And farmers can already, whilst collecting data, they can already observe and notice if there are common things, as if there are insect infestations and how the crops are doing. And then there was a comment about the fact that data analysis is not just about the processing of data, but it's also the discussion that goes around the whys and the hows of the research and why we are analyzing data in a certain way. And that is separate again from the quantitative part, which may be useful to kind of notice things that need to be further explored. I don't know if I forgot anything from anyone from my group.
Let's just hear from the other two groups, and if there's anything forgotten overall, we'll get it then. And we'll let group two. Jane, do you have anything to add?
We ran out of time, so we didn't really have time for a generic discussion. So the two examples we had, one was not really farmers doing the analysis, but saying what they wanted to see in the results. So I suppose the generic comment would be that there's a difference between involving farmers fully in analysing the data or them driving how they want to visualise the analysis at the end of the results. And then the other example, again, it was from Dryland's FRN. So that was about the farmers actually doing the analysis together. So they were actually comparing, different interventions for strengthening terraces, let's say, by comparing depth with sticks. So again, I suppose that would be a good example of where farmers are doing the analysis in a way that they understand. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Cool.
Sam, anything from group one?
Yeah, there was quite a nice example given about sort of more visual based analysis. So there was an example of a soil erosion trial where over various stages of the trial going on, farmers were collecting wheelbarrows worth of eroded soil, and it was quite visually clear to them that at the start of the trial, before any treatments were happening, they were needing 6 wheelbarrows worth of soil, and then by the end of the trial, they were needing 3 wheelbarrows worth of soil. So the analysis through both their experience, but then also sharing that experience of the results was sort of quite powerful. And because in this case, it was quite a easy to grasp and also very visual result in terms of data rather than a pure number. Similar comments to, I think, what Romina mentioned. I think it was Mary who was making the point that in the focus groups, the analysis has the potential to be much richer because the people involved in those groups have so much more information and knowledge about the context in which the work is being conducted and the trial is happening. So if they can be involved and the data can be made clear to them in a way, then the insights that can be gained from that can be much more powerful because the additional context that they have. But it's a difficult balance. And I think that was the general theme of this line of discussion, that it was a difficult thing to achieve, especially as the analysis often happens away from the farmers, both in terms of space and time of the data is taken away from the field, analysed at home, and then maybe if you're lucky, some results will go back to the farmers a few months later.
Okay, very good. Thanks for that. Are there any other observations that anything missing from that discussion of your experiences with involving farmers in analysis? I think it's insightful to say when you are trying to involve farmers in analysis, that is sometimes the distinction between data collection and analyzing and interpreting data is not clear. those things can happen, particularly if you're in a group situation, those things can happen sort of all at the same time. Lucy.
Thank you. I think, yeah, just the most, like I remembered I have been involved in getting similar people to farmers. I didn't do the analysis myself or lead it, but I was involved in a group, so preparing it. The main point to me is always, if you want other people to analyze the data, it needs to be shared in a form and in a way which is accessible to them. So in this particular context, it was, it was qualitative data and it was lots of text, but basically it had all been written down. But so we were identifying a selection of bits of text, a selection of ideas, basically, that would lead to a productive discussion. If we had given them all of the data, it would have been too much for people to read. A, they may not have been able to read it, in terms of how literate they are, but B, in terms of the time, time constraints, it takes too long. So there was a filtering, let's say, of data first and a preparation of data before the co-analysis, and reflection on how people would be involved and how to get them to compare their own experiences to what other people had shared and things.
Okay.
If that helps.
Carlos.
In terms of the analysis, and from the point of view of the dialogue that is established within the farmer community and with the researchers, the whys and the hows are really important. But what I have noticed is that farmers are really interested in the possible explanations that come from the researchers as well. That is, again, another place where there is a lot of sharing of information and valuable information that comes from both sides. And doing it with a little bit of sensitivity is quite useful, because farmers appreciate very much information that comes from outside. Okay,
nice. Well, thanks to everyone for those comments, because it does lead us into the last little bit of this session where I wanted to talk about an analysis of data. And I'm going to give an example. I'm going to stick with our cowpea trial and analysis of some of this quantitative or sort of semi-quantitative information. I think it is harder when we're talking about analysis of qualitative data. Let's see what I managed to put together, but it certainly touches on things that many of you have said. First of all, what do we mean by analysis of data, analysis of a research data set? I think it's all these things, reducing a lot of data to the key important messages or findings. It means being able to draw lessons from multiple cases. If you have like a single example, there's often not much analysis to do. There's interpretation to do, trying to understand why is this example like this. But the real analysis or the hard analysis comes when you've got multiple cases, like lots of farmers doing the same, testing these varieties, and they're not all getting the same results. Different things are happening. So amongst those multiple cases, we're trying to find understandable patterns. Try to find something that stands out that we can use that does make some sense. This is often described as separating signal, that is the information we want, from the noise, that's information that is somehow obscuring that signal. Or the idea of repeatable patterns is important, or relationships. So everybody's cowpeas are growing differently, but what is consistent about that? Is there something repeatable? Can we find that frequently one variety has higher germination than another? That's the sort of thing we're trying to find out when we're analyzing data. And the important point in terms of what we're discussing now of involving farmers in the analysis stage in the research cycle is that you can do these things up here, reducing a lot of data to get important messages, understanding patterns, etc. You can do those without necessarily calculating summaries and drawing graphs and tables and using analysis of variance and regression models and doing statistical tests and saying something is significant. This is not what analysis means. If you happen to have data which is amenable to statistical analysis, these are useful techniques, or these can be useful techniques to help you achieve the things at the top of the screen. But this is not data analysis. It's what's at the upper half of the screen here, which is the data analysis. methods of doing this with farmers, engaging farmers in analysis, have been around since the 1980s. You look in Chambers was talking about his participatory research, then what some people are slightly rudely call, Chambers bean counting has been there and it's been used for at least 40 years. And I suspect that many of you have used these. And if you haven't seen these methods, then you should get familiar with them. I just simulated data. I simulated this example of the varieties of Dr. Sayansi and Mama Kalima. I then simulated them doing some analysis here. And they're looking at that germination data. And here's a little method that can be done. It's extremely simple, but it's empowering because it's easy to understand and it involves people. If we're talking about research that empowers farmers, then it's somehow got to grab their imagination. They've somehow got to be involved in it. And so the sorts of things you can do with physical materials rather than on computer screens can bring that reality to what's going on and make sure that people do feel engaged. And so remember, they were going to record germination as being very low, the same as what they used to, or higher, or very much higher. And there are 20 farmers in the group, and each one says for variety number one, they've got one of these bits of wood and they put it against what their data for germination said. And when you get something like that, you can discuss with farmers what it means, interpretation, and you can notice, for example, that this is kind of curious, that a lot of farmers found that the germination of this new variety was much higher than what they used to, but there are also some that found it's much lower. So what's going on there? And this is, as several of you mentioned, this is where you can start discussing why. What do you think might be the reasons for that? And very often, those farmers will have some suggestions for what the reasons are. And those then inform the next bit of analysis. So these farmers happen to say, I think this happens when, some people's plots were very wet at the beginning of the season. There was even waterlogging. And I think that low germination is to do with waterlogging. Okay, so say, all right, who had waterlogging in the group? Let's put your bits of wood separate from those who didn't have waterlogging. And what do we get? And we get something like this. Say, oh yeah, indeed, look, those people that had very wet ground at the beginning of the season tended to get low germination, and those that had normal ground at the beginning of the season got high germination. So in this case, we've managed to explain some of that variation, which was visible in the data. And it's a sort of insight that can really only come from farmers. If you were a researcher, just had the germination data and you went back to your office and you ran the analysis, you would find this and you would probably say, well, on average, it's about the same as normal. And that would completely miss the point. And you wouldn't have that additional insight that comes from farmers. But it does require farmers to be engaged and understanding. And if you just giving, for example, a paper report with a graph on it might not give all your farmer members they might not really understand what's happening. And I tried to summarize this in this way. It's become conventional that this is the way we do this sort of research with farmers. We have farmers doing their experiments, and we have groups and researchers, and there's typically a process of data aggregation. Farmers' data is somehow collected together at group level, and the group level data is collected together, and the researchers take it away and they do some analysis and they reach some conclusions. And because they are good ethical researchers, they then feed back the results to farmers. And I've been at lots of meetings where that feedback is happening, and the farmers get together and the researchers come and present what they found. It's not uncommon for the reaction of farmers at that stage is to say, well, we knew that because that's what we told you, right? It doesn't actually bring additional insights. But if you now say this is a joint activity, then it looks rather different. Because farmers, remember that diagram from Dan and Nuru's investigation, say farmers learn from their own plots. even if a farmer was the only one to do that experiment, they would learn something from it. They would interpret what they're seeing when they compare these cowpea varieties and reach some conclusions. When groups get together and talk about what they've seen and their others, and they do this sort of participatory analysis, they also reach some conclusions. Those researchers, they do the statistical analysis and they reach some conclusions. But these things need to interact. So I think generally, you know, what moves down the page here are these insights and explanations. What was going on? Well, it was the waterlogging, or it was the weeds, or it was those little beetles that they ate the flowers, and that's really where the problem was. And then the researcher's analysis, if it's well done, can reveal patterns which are not visible to individuals or groups because they've got access to more data from more people, and they're pulling the data from many farmers together. They should be revealing patterns which are otherwise not available. So farmers and groups can do their own analysis and interpretation, and those insights that they get can and should be informing researchers' analysis. And then that researchers' sort of reanalysis, there's a loop here, provides further information back to farmers. And if that process goes well, then the result is it's a real joint analysis that is richer than the sum of the two parts. It's richer than what farmers would do on their own, and it's richer than what researchers could do on their own. And that's real co-created research working nicely. So I think that's a sort of ideal to strive for. All right, so we're running out of time. I know some of you need to leave. If you have to leave, then please leave. I've just got a couple more minutes, if you'll allow me, just to wrap up. So overall, what have we got so far? I hope that the message you're getting out of this whole series of sessions has been that engaging farmers all around this research cycle, not just in a few specific places, is certainly possible. Okay, I missed off here. It's valuable, it's useful, it enriches what's going on, it enriches it from everybody's point of view. It probably needs some new tools and ideas that you haven't been using before, and it requires that change in mindset of the researchers. That change in mindset from thinking that the farmers are engaged in the research to this is joint research. It's not farmers engaged in my research, or certainly not farmers doing my research. This is a joint enterprise, and what it looks like and what comes out of it will be very different from if it was research of a different type. I believe that research of all these types, there's a role for all these types of research. I think there is a role sometimes for research which the researchers do the designing and farmers just implement it. Sometimes that's going to be appropriate, but it's not the only way. We were trying to talk here about the research that is based on FRN principles that say farmers are involved all the way around. I hope that this series has given you a few ideas on that. Thank you everybody for your attention, and we'll see you all again sometime.